Market Center, CUNY. And she's also a fellow at the University of Cincinnati Corrections Institute.
About 20 years ago, a family member became addicted to drugs. He'd started using methamphetamine, and over time, he lost his job, he lost his house, he stopped spending time with his family, and he stopped spending time with his friends other than those that used. His whole life became about using drugs. It was awful. And after about 2 years, he was arrested. And to be honest, it was a bit of a relief because we knew where he was and we thought that he would get help. Instead, he was convicted and he was sent to prison, which was terrifying because we didn't know if he would be okay. We didn't know if he was safe, and we didn't know that he would get the help that he needed. Thankfully, this story has a happy ending. He came home from prison, he got a job, he fell in love and got married, has helped to raise a beautiful family, and he's stayed out of trouble ever since. But he's one of the lucky ones. He's lucky because he had a strong family, and he was able to get a job easily. And he's lucky because he was able to escape that cycle that far too many people get trapped in. That cycle of using drugs, being arrested, going to prison, coming home, and doing it all over again. Today, we are in the throes of an opioid crisis. Every day, we're reading about young people overdosing, and we're reading about the heartbreak of families and parents. And I'm guessing that you have people in your community that are struggling with drug use. And for some of you, it's a friend or a family member. And some of these people are going to turn to crime. They'll turn to crime to get drugs, to get money, or just because they're no longer making good choices. The question becomes, what do we do? What we should not do is lock people up. We should not be locking people up for their drug use. In the United States, we have 2 million people in prison and one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And yes, some people belong in prison, but not all of them. In 2016, 15% of those in state and local prisons and almost half of those in federal prisons were there because of a drug crime. That was their most serious offense. And again, some of them are probably hardened criminals, but many of them are like my family member. They got caught up using drugs, they made bad choices, and they didn't get the help that they needed. So prison is not the answer. I believe that our system should be about helping people to be more successful, about rehabilitating people. And prison is great for punishment, but it's not so good for rehabilitation. In fact, prison can make people worse. As some of you probably know, almost half of those coming home from prison are rearrested within a year of their release, and over 75% are rearrested within 5 years. We shouldn't be sending people to prison for their drug use. So what should we do? Research tells us that we can keep people in the community on supervision and provide treatment and have better outcomes. And again, I understand this need for punishment. But let's be honest, probation is punishment. Having to check in with a probation officer, being drug tested, those are forms of accountability. And so people are not getting off scot-free, but we are more likely to help them, and at a significantly less cost than sending people to prison. The state of New York spends $69,000 a year to incarcerate a single person. Imagine what we could do with that money. We can keep people home, we can give them treatment, we can keep our community safe, and we can save money. Why not do that? But a critical part of this is that they need treatment, and they need effective treatment. Supervision alone is not expected to change behavior in the long term. But sadly, not all treatment is equal. Some treatment is better than others. researchers have identified 3 principles of effective intervention: risk, need, and responsivity. The risk principle tells us who we should be targeting for intervention. The need principle tells us what we should be targeting. And responsivity tells us how we should go about delivering these interventions. And programs that adhere to these 3 principles are significantly more effective than programs that don't. As I said, the risk principle tells us who. The risk principle says that we should match the level of service and supervision to the level of risk, or the likelihood that someone will get into trouble again. This means for individuals that are more likely to get into trouble, we need to do more. And for people that are relatively low risk for reoffending, they're not likely to get into trouble again, we don't need to do as much. This principle also says that if we violate it, if we overserve people, if we give low-risk people too many services, that we're likely to do harm. This can sound counterintuitive, but it makes sense if we think about what predicts criminal behavior. Researchers have identified 8 central predictors of recidivism. These include having a criminal history, having criminal friends, having certain personality characteristics like poor decision-making or low self-control, and having criminal thoughts, values, and beliefs. Things like, not a big deal to do drugs, everyone does them. Or, I drive better when I'm drunk. In addition, we know that the nature of family relationships, drug use, how we spend our free time, and having a job or not predicts recidivism. And so someone who is low risk has a lot of really good things going on in their lives. They likely have good relationships with their family. They probably have a job. They have good friends. And maybe they're involved in the community through a rec league or a church group. And if we overserve them, if we make them go to treatment 3 times a week and they check in with their probation officer once a week and they're getting drug tested 4 times a week, we make it really difficult to keep all of those good parts of their lives in play. And so we make their lives more challenging, and we increase the likelihood that they will get into trouble. To meet this principle, our programs need to use validated, standardized assessments that help to distinguish and identify someone's risk level so that we can make sure that we're doing more for those that need more and not harming those that need less. So the risk principle tells us who. The need principle tells us what we should be targeting for intervention. And the need principle says that we should be targeting those criminogenic needs, or those risk factors that can be changed. And that when we change those risk factors, we change someone's likelihood of reoffending. It's important that our programs recognize that not everyone has the same needs, and some drug users will have many more treatment needs and others have less. So for example, imagine that we have someone who started using drugs when they were a teenager. They've never held down a job. They've cut off ties with their family, and everyone that they know is involved in drug use and criminal behavior. If we only put them into drug treatment, we're not really addressing the array of needs that they have. And that means they're likely to get into trouble again, right? That they need help with their drug use, but they also probably need to learn how to get and hold a job. And we need to help them reconnect with their family and maybe teach them how to have healthy relationships and teach them how to identify positive friends and no longer associate with those criminal friends. If we don't do those things, they're less likely to be successful. It's sort of like if you're sick and you have a fever and you go to the doctor, and the doctor gives you Tylenol to treat the fever, but doesn't do anything else. You might feel better for a little bit, but you're still going to be sick. So just like with the risk principle, our programs need to use standard validated assessments to identify someone's criminogenic needs, those risk factors that can change, and then treat them accordingly. I also want to point out that not all drug users have the same severity of a drug problem. And some people will need more intensive services than others. Some people might need detox or residential treatment, while other people will be okay with outpatient treatment. And for opioid users, some people might need medically assisted treatment like methadone, but not everyone will. And so we need to make sure that we're assessing people and identifying their individual needs so that we can use our resources most effectively. So the risk principle tells us who, the need principle tells us what, and responsivity tells us how we should go about delivering these interventions. Specifically, it tells us about the type of intervention that we should provide, the type of treatment, and it reminds us that people are individuals and they respond differently to treatment, and we need to make sure that we're attentive to that. When you think about drug treatment, you probably think about AA and NA, or maybe a 30-day residential program where people sit around and talk about their feelings and challenge one another when they're not making progress. These types of approaches are less effective at changing behavior long-term than others. The responsivity principle tells us that we need to use cognitive behavioral or behavioral interventions to get the greatest effect. A cognitive behavioral intervention teaches people how to recognize the link between their thoughts, feelings, and actions. It assumes that when people have irrational, extreme criminal thinking, that they're more likely to engage in irrational, extreme criminal behavior. But it also assumes that we can change the nature of that thinking and that we can teach people skills to manage situations differently. So imagine that you're trying to lose weight. You're trying to eat really healthy, you're on a diet, you're working out regularly, and yet you find yourself slipping. A cognitive behavioral program is going to help you identify the reasons that you're slipping. So maybe you realize that, wow, I cheat every time I've had a long day at work. And we're going to explore the thinking around that. And maybe it's that you think, I survived this long day at work and I deserve a reward. A cognitive behavioral program is going to teach people to identify that thinking and start to think about that situation differently. Or perhaps come up with different ways to reward yourself. So for someone who's using drugs, we want them to identify situations where they're more likely to use. Right? Maybe it's when they're angry. Maybe it's when they're bored. Maybe it's when a friend offers them drugs. A good program is going to help them identify those situations, focus on their thinking around those situations, and also teach them some skills for managing those situations differently. So maybe we teach some anger management skills, or we teach people how to have fun while being sober, or we teach people how to walk away from someone who's offering them drugs, or better yet, we teach them how to find new friends who won't offer them drugs. So responsivity says we need to use a cognitive behavioral intervention. It also says we need to be attentive to individual differences, individual characteristics that might impact someone's ability to be successful in treatment. Things like motivation or demographics or personality or other characteristics. Imagine that you're 18 years old and that you're put into a treatment group with a bunch of 40 and 50-year-olds. Chances are you're not going to have a lot in common. And you might show up to group and you're like, I don't know what they're talking about. I don't relate to this. And so even if you're motivated, you might stop going to that group because it's not relevant to you. Or imagine that you have a young child and you don't have childcare. Or that you don't have a car, you don't have public transportation, and your group is 20 miles away. It's hard to be successful in group when you can't get there. Responsivity says we need to identify these barriers and remove them so that people can be successful in group. Because when people are successful in group and they graduate treatment, they're more likely to be successful long term. I want to take a minute and talk about relapse. It's hard to change behavior. If you tried to lose weight, you've probably slipped. You probably have relapsed. But it doesn't mean that you're a failure, and it doesn't mean that you should give up on that goal. I think we're far too quick to punish people when they relapse. And yes, again, we need to hold people accountable, but we also need to take a look at what's happening Where are they in their behavior change process? And adjust our services accordingly. And if it's a family member or a friend who's relapsing, recognize that they're not a failure. They haven't failed. And continue to support and encourage them to engage in treatment. Having a family member addicted to drugs is devastating. It's awful. You feel helpless, you can't fix it, but you can help them. You can support them, and you can encourage them to go to treatment. And you can advocate for empirically supported treatment options in your community. Having programs in your community that adhere to risk, need, and responsivity is good for all of us. Having effective programs means that we can keep people home, we can keep families intact, we can save money, and most of all, we can reduce drug and crime use. Thank you.